But today, what we're going to be doing is offering a little bit of an updated sort of mental health refresher, right? So we'll review some very foundational concepts related to the topic of mental health. We'll then get into exploring the kind of current and shifting trends of mental health within the sort of Canadian landscape. We'll talk about its impact on ourselves and on our workplaces, and then we'll also share a little bit of information on what we can do to also aid in creating that much more supportive and open workplace culture. So as I mentioned throughout the presentation, there will be some questions that I'll have for you. And it looks like we're all able to utilize the chat feature, which is really awesome. So when I do ask you questions, feel free to share in the chat, as well as those questions as well. So I'm kind of setting the scene here, talking a little bit about the current mental health landscape within our country. So there's been some emerging research that kind of shows what those trends and those changes are looking like. We'll start with Statistics Canada. So they recently shared the end of a 10-year survey looking at our mental health state within the country. And we saw, unfortunately, a couple of, slightly concerning things here. We saw, first and foremost, over the past decade, the number of Canadians experiencing symptoms of, depression surged by more than 60%, and cases of certain mood and anxiety disorders nearly doubled as well. If we're looking more specifically at the groups affected by these challenges, we saw that the largest increases were seen amongst young people. Even more specifically than that, young women aged 15 to 24 years of age. But, it's not just young women who are struggling. This also extends to other equity-deserving groups, more specifically, including adults living with disabilities, LGBTQ plus communities, Canadians in the lowest income group, and Indigenous people, amongst many more equity deserving groups as well. More specifically as well, we saw a little bit of a change in what was once a very kind of commonly referred to statistic. So you might recall the frequently used 1 in 5 statistic that we sometimes use in our country, which refers to 1 in 5 Canadians experiencing a mental illness within their lifetime. But actually, some more emerging research does show that this number has shifted quite a bit, where we see that this is actually closer to about 1 in 3 individuals these days. And just as a little bit of a reminder, if you're not familiar, this means that within your life, 1 in 3 individuals will either live with, or you'll know that they'll live with, a mental illness, or you yourself will personally be diagnosed within your lifetime. And more broadly than that, of course, we also see that consistent statistic that about half of us will face a mental health challenge by the time we turn 40 years old. So, unfortunately, some pretty kind of concerning statistics, maybe not surprising if we think about the way that we've kind of felt, more recently, or heard from our colleagues and from each other. But, I wanted to kind of dig a bit deeper into understanding why this is happening. What is contributing to these statistics? So that's actually the first question that I wanted to ask you. So feel free to kind of sit with that for a moment or two. And when you're ready, I'd love to hear from you, what you think are some of the underlying causes that are contributing to mental health challenges, within our country and our organization. So if you were to just kind of share what you think is contributing to that, or maybe even reflect a little bit about your own personal stressors, if you feel comfortable enough to share. Yeah, world events, certainly. Yeah, certain social media can have negative effects on youth. Yeah, certainly. And I think exposure to media in general, can certainly challenge the way that we sort of navigate our day-to-day, or maybe the way that we think and kind of feel. Information overload, yeah, definitely. I think an extension of that for sure. Financial stress, yeah, unfortunately, a very real kind of challenge these days. Economic uncertainty, daily politics, yeah. The demand of the workplace and how fast-paced life is now. Yeah, absolutely. And if you were in our previous session about boundary encouraging behaviors a couple of months back, you would certainly remember that we did talk about that as well. Seasons, yeah. stressing that long, cold winter. Yeah, I think in our country specifically, I think we collectively in the office yesterday just celebrated, finally seeing sun for the first time. And I think that certainly impacts the way that we feel. Yeah, lack of access to healthcare. Yeah, absolutely. Isolation. Yeah, continuously adapting ourselves to changes. Yeah, and needing to kind of be agile. And that's great as a strategy, but sometimes it can be a bit tiring, right? Especially when we are, experiencing that challenge and just need a little bit of time to kind of rest and recharge. What else do we see here? Yeah, working from home if you're living on your own, definitely. Yeah, I think kind of one of the cons that we see sometimes with flexible arrangements maybe is that, although there are certainly some pros as well. Social interaction, yeah, hard to navigate supports. Yeah, so we know we need care, but maybe we don't necessarily know how to access it or know where we need to go in order to access it. Yeah, so thank you so much for sharing some of those thoughts there, especially if maybe you yourself were relating to any of them and that's what kind of drew you to share. I certainly wanted to appreciate that, moment of vulnerability to share. And I think lots of us also definitely resonate with what was in the chat there, especially seeing some consistent messaging there. So yeah, so we did, a little bit of research ourselves into lying causes to some of these challenges within our country, and we'll use some accenting research to dig even deeper than that as well. But in 2024, so just at the end of 2024, CMHA actually released a real kind of deep dive into the landscape of mental health within our country, and that is referred to as the State of Mental Health in Canada report. And I do absolutely urge you to take a peek at that if you haven't already. We did some really fantastic work into uncovering some of those challenges and those major themes. And of this, large body of research, we did in fact uncover 3 major themes, some of which we shared in the chat. First and foremost, mental health care within our country is unfortunately very underfunded. Canada only invests about 6% into mental health as a percentage of the overall healthcare budget, compared to other countries like, Germany or France, for example, who invest about 11 and 15% respectively. The extension of that is that, mental health is then often seen as a privilege, right? Only available to those who can access it or who can afford it. And like we mentioned earlier, folks with the lowest incomes then, experience challenges, right? And report having anxiety about 2.4 times more often than those with the highest incomes. We also saw then that access to care depends on where you live, where people in Canada receive drastically different care depending on their home province or territory. And an extension of that then is where we see Indigenous and racialized people facing the greatest barriers to care. And finally, we see that there does need to be a continued dive into mental health as a sort of body of research. Data about mental health in Canada is lacking compared to all of that information that's available to us, right? And by that metric, then, we can't fix what we don't measure. And so it's important for us to continue to dig deeper to uncover some of these challenges. But in the meantime, we can look to other sort of emerging and supportive research to dig a bit deeper into that as well, where the CSA group did some complementary research as well into the underlying causes contributing to forming some of these themes, right? And some of these, and actually all of these, are something that we did share in the chat, where we saw that, financial and personal challenges, of course, contribute to our poor mental health. Like we mentioned earlier, there has been that overall downward trend in mental health in the country, which was unfortunately exacerbated or accelerated by COVID-19, but we continue to feel those increased feelings, of stress and even isolation still. But, even today, right, we're still experiencing this in combination with personal challenges like our daily stress or our familial responsibilities. And we're also feeling the stress from things like, Canada's stagnant economy, rising household debt and increased living costs as well. Working conditions, as we'll continue to explore, of course, in this workplace mental health session, also significantly impacts our mental health and well-being. And in fact, a study in Canada did show that about 80% of people who were absent from work or on long-term disability did cite job demands or work environment conditions as that primary cause of their poor mental health. And interestingly, a global study did also show that managers' influence on our mental health is actually greater than those sometimes of our spouses, or more than doctors or therapists, right? And so we can really appreciate just how much the workplace can impact our mental health and well-being. Inadequate public funding, right, as we just uncovered, and kind of digging a bit deeper into what has brought us to public funding being a challenge when it comes to mental health. So if we take a bit of a step back into 1984 specifically, Canada did enact the Canada Health Act, which ensured that all eligible residents has reasonable access to medically necessary hospital and physician services without direct charges, which is great, of course, right? But the challenge with mental health is that most mental health services are not classified as medically necessary and are therefore excluded from the same coverage, which makes regular mental health visits both expensive and sometimes completely inaccessible. And so as a result, about 20% of Canadians report financial barriers, specifically being that barrier to accessing that mental health care. And finally, we also see an overall shortage of mental health professionals that can help us when we need it. So, long wait times, unfortunately, is very typical for counseling or therapy services in our country, for example. Research shows that it's anywhere from about 20 days to 4 months in more rural areas. And unsurprisingly, then, long wait times have been shown to complicate symptoms further and increase the risk of chronic mental health conditions and pressures on those emergency services. And there's a lot of reasons for these shortages. A demographic shift, right, in many practitioners nearing retirement, recruitment challenges in replacing those folks who retire, limited capacity in training programs, insufficient incentives in the field to bring people into the mental health care space. So unfortunately, there are a number of different challenges that contribute to this being this greater, mental health issue within our country. And there's lots that we should certainly do on a global kind of scale in order to further support ourselves. But for the purpose of what we're going to kind of talk about today, of course, we're going to kind of bring our lens back into the workplace conversation, and we'll talk about what this means in terms of the cost of mental health challenges and illnesses. And this is really sort of important information to hold with us, especially when we're thinking about just how important programs like Not Myself Today are, conversations like the conversation that we're going to have today, and hopefully the conversations that you'll feel a bit more empowered to have moving forward are within our workplace. So, we know that the cost of mental health challenges and illnesses to our Canadian economy is at least and continues to grow beyond about $50 billion per year. And in saying that, of course, we do want to appreciate that folks with mental health challenges or illnesses can absolutely still positively contribute to their workplaces. When they're not supported, this unfortunately also translates into a cost of about $17 billion in loss per organization per year. And of course, then employers would feel the impact of this through things like, loss of engagement, loss of productivity, high turnover, and most notably, time spent away from work, where we also see that up to about 500,000 employees need to take time away from work every single week, specifically due to a mental illness. Right? So what do we do about this? Well, of course, we can begin to break down even the smallest barriers to being able to have these open conversations within our workplaces, right? And many organizations are ready to kind of get going, right? And they implement all of these sort of programs and trainings, and that's fantastic. But sometimes we gloss over the power of even these basic discussions that we're having today, right? And kind of aligning this conversation within our workplace so that we have this sort of collective understanding of just how important this conversation is. And maybe it means that these numbers is that kind of turning point to getting people on board. Right. And I think what also comes with that is really kind of appreciating just how much of an impact the time that we spend in our organization truly has on our mental health and well-being. And so I wanted to ask you another question to kind of reflect more specifically the way we just shared in the workplace itself. So if you were to share now what factors you think influence our well-being in the workplace, what comes to mind? You know, what kind of conditions, behaviors, stressors even contribute to our health and well-being in the workplace specifically? Flexibility? Yeah, absolutely. So if we have it or maybe don't have it, that can be a challenge, right? The culture, yeah, the overall culture. You know, how do we feel every day that we're in that workplace environment? Is it supportive or is it challenging for us, right? Lack of resources, lack of time, yeah, lack of capacity. Absolutely. Yeah, connection to others. Yeah, where if we do have that connection, that can have a really sort of powerful impact, maybe on the days where we're not feeling so great, right? Or proactively can keep us well, right? Understanding that mental health is health. Yeah, it's part of this kind of greater conversation of what our health actually is, right? Not just our social or our financial or our physical health, right? It's this comprehensive understanding of our health and well-being. Yeah. Supportive managers, absolutely. Yeah, one of the most important, some research does say, right? Autonomy, needing to manage our health. Yeah, so knowing that we have that responsibility, right? Having a supportive leader, yeah, supervisors, values align, yeah, with our values. So we kind of commonly understand what's important to us, right? Being able to delegate and share tasks. Yeah, so having that confidence, I think maybe that's a twofold, right? Having the confidence in others to know that they will support us when we ask, but also having the confidence to even ask in the first place, right? And knowing that if things do get to be challenging, we have those outlets to support us in our workplace. Yeah, and finally, that recognition, right? Being able to be valued for the really great work that we do, right? And that's important, right? To kind of drive us to continue putting in 100% or even 70% in a day, right? Is that we need that recognition that the work that we're doing is important and feeds into this kind of greater purpose within our organization. Yeah, so thanks so much for sharing that. And what I wanted to also kind of highlight here is that there are a number of different conditions that impact our mental health and well-being while we're simultaneously in the work environment, right? And we'll start with the workplace itself, right? Where decent, meaningful work does contribute to our mental health in a positive way, right? We achieve a livelihood from it, which is important, right? A sense of confidence, of purpose, of achievement, this kind of platform for structure, which sometimes is really important for us to feel accomplished and successful in a day. And for people with mental health challenges specifically, work can also really positively contribute to recovery and inclusion and aid in our confidence and our social functioning, right? So the workplace itself can be that source of support as well, right? Flexibility, like we shared, resources, meaningful relationships, you know, manageable and fulfilling workloads. You know, these are really fantastic, positive aspects of our mental health, or of our workplace that contribute to our mental health. But in saying this, of course, this is true in a positive workplace, right? Appreciating that workplaces with non-supportive cultures, or the opposite of everything that we've just shared, can contribute to stress, right? And even impending burnout syndrome if it's not properly managed. And this is especially true when we think about just how much of our time we spend in this environment, where actually, on average, we find that we end up spending about a third of our lives, excuse me, a third of our lives in the workplace, right? Which comes out to about 90,000 total hours. So by that metric, of course, you know, the things that we're exposed to and the way that we're treated in this workplace severely impacts our mental health and well-being. But in addition to that, there's also a number of different things that we bring into the work environment that can impact our mental health and well-being in any given workday, right? These personal experiences and these stressors that we chatted about earlier all also follow us into the workplace, where every single day we bring everything to our workplaces. And this can be good, but this also means that what's difficult or challenging to us or for us outside of work often follows us into the work environment every morning or whenever our day starts, right? There's very few of us that can completely put everything on pause and pick it back up when we exit the workplace, right? And sometimes they might not have anything to do with work, but they make it more challenging for us to be engaged and connected and healthy when we're on the job if these things are weighing on us outside of the workplace. And the last thing is our personal resources, right? And this impacts the way that we interact with some of these stressors, where I'm sure we all know some people who, despite a really challenging day, seem to find a way to stay positive or maintain some semblance of positivity or optimism. And by that same token, we might experience the exact same day, but find that to be really challenging. And the difference between the two folks comes down to the skills and the resources that they've either developed for themselves or are able to seek out, right? And kind of develop over time in order to cope with the stressors of everyday life. And so we'll explore that together, during the kind of latter half when we talk about creating these supportive cultures that can foster that resilience within ourselves and within each other. And so that's what kind of brings us here, right? And so there are a number of different things that we can do as a collective and as individuals and as an organization in order to really encourage that culture that we want to see, right? Create that culture of support that we know and that research, of course, shows is really important in protecting our mental health and well-being. And so there are a couple different themes that we're going to cover and kind of refresh ourselves on here together. First, a supportive culture does uphold this shared understanding of what mental health is, what mental illnesses are, and the continuum that they exist on. So in hearing from lots of organizations who have developed safe cultures of their own, a whole number stated that this shared and accurate understanding of what we mean when we're referring to psychological health and safety in the first place is step one. Right? And when we appreciate the continuum of mental health and well-being, we really appreciate that there is no, one size fits all ultimate approach for every individual, right? And like we said earlier, so often organizations skip this step, right? And really make sure that there is that super solid foundation before we build upon that. The second theme is this shared understanding of those barriers that stigma creates and how to effectively dismantle them, where we only see this cohesive culture when we do address those barriers to having these conversations, right? Where stigma really thrives in that silence, right? And when we fail to talk openly about mental health, we reinforce those walls that we're really trying very hard to break down. And the third theme that we're going to explore is this shared responsibility, right? Where culture is built through really intentional acts that we all have some level of responsibility to prioritize. And as we'll explore, everyone, regardless of their role in the organization, does have an impact on whether the workplace does truly feel psychologically safe. So let's kind of refresh ourselves on each of these themes together. Starting with this common understanding of mental health and mental illnesses. So I'd love to just kind of hear from you here. If we're talking about mental health and mental illnesses, what are some terms that come to mind? So if someone were to ask you, what is mental health? Or, how is it different from mental illnesses? Or what is the kind of relationship between the two? What words or kind of terms, phrases, what things just pop into your mind when you're thinking of creating that sort of definition or sharing with someone your own thoughts? And I know earlier we were talking about, mental health is health, right? And so that's a kind of great thought, right? Where it's part of this greater conversation of our well-being. Yeah, mental health is a state of mind. Yeah, good or bad. Yeah, positive or poor maybe. Yeah. Resilience is a really important element of our mental health, and that ability to kind of navigate those tough days with success. Yeah. Does anything else come to mind if we were to kind of define mental health or mental illnesses? Any thoughts pop into your mind? A state of well-being? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah, so let's just kind of dive into sort of defining it, and feel free to keep sharing some thoughts in the chat as you have them. But if we were to start with defining mental health, and Sarah, you're exactly right. It is this state of well-being in which an individual is able to kind of realize their abilities, right? They're able to effectively navigate those typical stressors. They're able to work productively, and they're able to make those positive contributions to their communities. So when we are talking about mental health from this comprehensive view, we're talking about lots of different things, our emotions, our thoughts, our feelings, our ability to successfully navigate those problems, the social connections that we make in our environments, our understanding of the world as it exists around us. And so there are just as many factors that impact our mental health and well-being, right? Our environments, our life situations, our individual lived experiences, what those daily stressors actually are for each of us, coupled with those chemical or neurological conditions, cultural influences, right? There's lots of things that impact our overall health and well-being state. But if we're thinking more specifically about mental illnesses, there are some differences, right, between the two. Certainly, they impact one another, and we'll use our kind of dual continuum of mental health here that we see on the screen to further define that. But if we're thinking specifically of mental illnesses, this is where we see this alteration, right, in our thinking or our mood or our behavior that can cause significant distress and impaired functioning, often then impacting our social or our occupational or our other sort of activities. If we're thinking of what causes and contributes to mental illnesses, it's pretty tricky to define exactly, what that is, in that there is no one single cause, but there's a number of combinations of things, genetics and our environments. But there are things that also make us more susceptible to mental illnesses, familial history of mental illnesses, certain stressful or traumatic situations, socioeconomic conditions, culture, background, and experiences with challenges in our societies, like systemic racism and discrimination, of course, can also affect the way that we view health and illness, and our willingness or even our ability sometimes to access that mental health support, as we uncovered in some of that emerging research just a couple of minutes ago. And so to kind of tie this together, we can use this dual continuum of mental health to more kind of intently understand the impact and aspects of mental health and illnesses together. So the dual mental health model shows that while mental health and mental illnesses are related, they are also two distinct continuums. So this model also then highlights that mental health is more than just the absence of mental illnesses, and that people with a diagnosis can and do still experience mental wellness, and those without a diagnosis can also still experience challenges. Right? Where we see this kind of x-axis, or the left to right axis, representing that presence or absence, like we were just talking about, of mental illnesses, from no illness to diagnosable conditions like that depression or that anxiety. And the y-axis, or the top-down axis, represents our mental health state, which can range from positive to poor. And these dimensions can intersect, but are also independent from one another. So for instance, like I said earlier, someone without a mental illness might still feel overwhelmed or disengaged, which might kind of place them in that poor mental health quadrant or area. And the same is true about a person with anxiety, who might also have very strong social connections, or professional support. And so they can still exist in that positive mental health quadrant. So ultimately, what we're getting at here and what we really want to kind of drive home in our organizations and in our workplaces is that mental health is very fluid, and it's impacted and influenced by our environments, by our life situations, and by those circumstances. And there's lots of really fantastic resources on the Not Myself Today portal that really dig deeper into this. And that can kind of help us to set this, awareness level so that we can kind of begin to further the conversation together. So for example, we might start with that facts of the matter quiz, right? To help you identify your knowledge starting points as a group and those opportunities for us to kind of learn and grow together. Right? We can continue posting those posters and those videos that we can share to really make sure that this conversation is top of mind. And, we can look to our learning the basics as a kind of whole starting point. And specifically with our newer kind of manager portal as well, we have that mental health 101 conversation, which really allows us to set the scene for, understanding our responsibilities as leaders more specifically in furthering this conversation. And if we accent that by just embedding some of these continuous conversations and learning opportunities into our team meetings, for example, where maybe we review some of these concepts together or in casual conversation, what this then helps us to do is really kind of fluidly enter this next suggestion, which is to really break down some of those stigmatizing thoughts and perceptions in our work environments. And that brings me to the next kind of conversation that I want to have with you, which is this conversation of stigma. So if you were to just kind of think about what some examples of stigma in our work environments might be, what do you think that can kind of look or sort of feel like? If we were to think about stigmatizing actions or thoughts or behaviors, or maybe even thoughts that we have internally about our own health and well-being that can contribute to that stigma. So maybe that fear, right, of being open and being vulnerable. Yeah, and being afraid to ask for help, as we see there in that chat. Yeah. But what might contribute to that being a challenge, right? Maybe we unconsciously treat people different if we kind of understand or learn that they have a challenge, or maybe we fear that we will be treated different. Yeah, management not supporting that mental health is important. Yeah, right. So some of that kind of messaging is really powerful when it comes from the top, but if it's not coming from the top, then maybe we don't think it's important as an organization. Yeah, so that fear of being judged by our colleagues, absolutely. Yeah, coworkers or clients using stigmatizing language. Yeah, and we'll talk about some ways to break that down together as well. Remind you of the really fantastic sort of do's and don'ts. Yeah, fear to speak up if we need to do that, right? And that fear to show that vulnerability. Yeah, especially if we're thinking in the workplace, right? Maybe who we are kind of impacts our level of comfort. Maybe we're a leader and we don't want to admit that we also experience some of these challenges. Maybe we're new to the organization and we don't want to be known as, a person who's not capable, for example, right? Lack of psychological safety in the workplace to be vulnerable. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so thank you so much for sharing those in the chat. And we'll just kind of confirm that with this, kind of deeper dive into stigma, where stigma is this negative attitude, right? Or this belief or this behavior that's held by a society or a group of people towards individuals. And in this case, those individuals being folks with mental illnesses, right? And this often stems from a lack of accurate information, maybe, which leads to fear or avoidance or, stereotyping or discrimination, right? And so if we think about the sort of prevalence of stigma, it's super widespread, unfortunately, when we're talking about mental health, right? It's in our communities, it's in our social circles, and it's also in our workplaces. And it is that major barrier to seeking help, with about 60% of people avoiding treatment on a global kind of cultural scale, but about, 2/3 within our organization if we're thinking about that fear of sharing in the workplace. So, stigma is a real significant barrier to care as well, right? It restricts access to diagnosis, to treatment, to employment, to housing, to other necessities, right? Which deepens that social marginalization. And this, of course, then worsens symptoms. It impacts our relationships with ourselves and with others, and it reduces that quality of life while also delaying or avoiding treatment, which can lead to more chronic conditions. So, of course, then, it makes total sense that early preventative treatment tends to almost always cost less than treating advanced mental health challenges. And so, we can dig just a bit deeper into the various types of stigma in order to understand how to break down. So first we have structural stigma. So this are, the kind of societal policies or institutional practices that disadvantage certain groups, which reinforces that inequality or those stereotypes, right? So if we think about our workplaces, not allowing mental health days in the same way that we allow other versions of, sick days, for example, right? We can think about social stigma, which is maybe the most kind of second most common one that we think of when we think of social stigma. It's where we kind of perpetuate these stereotypes about folks with challenges in the way that we interact with each other and in media portrayals as well, right? So if we label people with terms like lazy or crazy, we really reinforce that stigma. And unfortunately, the media is a really great catalyst for this, right? Where we see people with mental illnesses being presented as violent or unstable. Although research does show that they are actually more likely to be victims rather than perpetrators of violence. And finally, we see self-stigma. So this occurs when individuals internalize all of those negative thoughts and beliefs that they are constantly exposed to in our societies and in our workplaces. So, for example, a person with depression might feel ashamed and then avoid help due to these kind of internalized messages that mental illnesses are weak, make you weak, or, that you're not able to, contribute positively, which might worsen those symptoms and reinforce that isolation. So, we know then that this can negatively impact our mental health and well-being state. And we also know that all of this is true in our work environments as well. So what do we do about it? How do we help to really kind of break down and shift that culture to be one where we have tools available to us to talk openly about our challenges and get access to that support that we need and know that we can ask for it? And I think the really natural first step here is to really kind of normalize some of these mental health conversations. And you're here today, which is really fantastic because it means that you're interested in the topic, and that's so great. But we need to make sure that this is extended into our culture in general, right? And I think we can really lean into this concept of being vulnerable in, our emotions and our feelings, where, when someone does ask how we're doing, we don't default to that good, how are you? Right? Because every time we do this, we miss out on an opportunity for more genuine and authentic connection and maybe even vulnerable connection, right? So the next time someone asks you, I do challenge you to ask or answer with a bit more of a description, right? Really kind of sit with how you are feeling, especially if you're having a tough day. And when someone does the same, we can show that support and that validation. And we can make this a real sort of a concrete practice within our organizations as well, right? Having those, 1 to 10 mood check-ins, having these mental health moments built into our agendas, where it's not just a conversation that we have, maybe once a year, right? But it's this consistent message that this is something that's important to us as an organization. And we can also then do our part to pay attention, right? When we notice someone acting a little bit different from what's typical to them, can we check in with them? Or do we, kind of lean into some of those signs and check in with them, right? Do we provide an opportunity for them to share their concerns, especially if we're the leaders in this conversation? Do we welcome a discussion on what we can do for them to make things a bit easier while they're experiencing that challenge? And when we are engaging in conversation, whether it's about a challenge or even just a casual, check-in with those around us, are we making sure to be mindful of our language, to make sure that we are being inclusive and that we are being supportive. And as you'll sort of know, right, is that we do have this choice about the words that we use to describe ourselves, to describe each other, and to describe the world around us. And so when we are a bit intentional about it, we might be surprised by just how often we default to stigmatizing language, or we might not even know that we're speaking in a stigmatizing manner until we really try to kind of dismantle that. So, these things that we've talked about before, are we replacing harmful terms like crazy or lazy or weak with more either neutral or supportive language, like, experiencing a challenge, right? Or taking really important steps to manage their health and well-being. Are we using person-first language when we are talking about mental illnesses or people experiencing mental illnesses, right? For example, saying that they have a mental illness instead of saying that they are mentally ill, right? And I know that this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. There are certain groups like the autistic, deaf and blind community who actually prefer us to using that kind of identity first language, but making sure, or rather person first, but are we just making sure to appreciate preference, right? Or if someone does correct us, are we making sure to really kind of lean into this being a learning process? Because there might be instances where we make mistakes, and that's completely okay, right? It's important to kind of be patient and share that patience with others as well, right? If someone corrects us, apologize, right? Correct yourself, try again the next time. And if someone else makes a mistake, you can share that information, from our language do's and don'ts resource or from yourself, right? To make sure that you're just doing your part in dismantling that stigma, right? Because as a collective, one of the best things that we can do for our culture is to really demonstrate that it's okay not to know everything and to make mistakes and to be open to learning, and kind of being along the ride for this learning process. And the last thing that we want to do and kind of take away from this stigma conversation is reframing asking for help as that sign of strength, right? Where very often self-stigma drives folks to hiding their challenges, especially in the workplace. And so it's really important as a culture to really drive the message that dealing with challenges is a lot easier to do if we're not doing it alone, and that we are an organization that supports asking for help. Right. And in fact, research shows that folks with social support networks in place are, 2 to even 3 times more likely to experience recovery from some of these challenges, as opposed to somebody who feels as though they need to do it in isolation. Right. And beyond recovery, having that strong support network can also act as a buffer against these future challenges. And so just the last thing that I want to kind of leave you with here is this final message that it is in everybody's interest to continue this conversation, right? And building this supportive culture is not the job of a single person or a department or, one ambassador in isolation. It really requires that active, ongoing commitment from every single person. When everyone, from the top leadership down to every individual contributor plays their part, the organization can truly and successfully become that really resilient, inclusive, and supportive environment that we're aiming to create for ourselves and for others. Right? But that might change a little bit depending on kind of who we are and, what influence maybe we can have on our organization. Of course, as senior leaders, it's really important, first and foremost, to kind of lead with that honesty and that integrity and really model the values that respect and reflect the safe and supportive and mentally healthy work culture that we want to see and establish for our organization. As leaders, people managers, we are often the kind of first on the scene when some of these challenges happen. We're the kind of problem solvers, we bring solutions to the table, and we're the ones that really provide options when things maybe don't go as planned, right? And so the same can be said when challenges occur with employees themselves, right? And really leaning into the fact that we as leaders are in a supernatural position to provide support and assistance to those who are struggling. So we need to really make sure that we're playing our part here in recognizing when folks do need that help and creating that environment where people know that they can share their challenges and be open to asking those questions and asking for that help when they need it. And finally, you and I, employees at all levels, we certainly also play a role in making sure that this, is a success throughout our organization, right? Actively participating, right? Contributing to the overall culture, being mindful in even our daily interactions with each other and our attitudes and our willingness to support one another. These things certainly all add up. Right? So maybe it means we look out for one another, right? We check in on a colleague, we offer help during stressful times, we share that positive feedback, but we also participate when we're asked to, right? Organizations do want to hopefully create a safe and supportive culture for their employees, but they won't know what that looks like if we don't tell them. Right. And so it's important for us to participate when we're asked to and really participate in creating that culture that we would like to see. And then acting in those ways that we know are important for us, right? Taking care of our own mental health, taking our breaks, exploring healthy coping mechanisms that work for us, creating boundaries if we can, asking for help when we need it. These are all ways for us to make sure that we're sort of living the culture that we would like to see. And so in saying that, I also do want to appreciate that sometimes there are instances where we may need a little bit of help, and that's completely okay. And so I wanted to share with you some future resources within the community if you do require them. And there is a summary of this on your Not Myself Today portal in future supports, but just as a little bit of a reminder, of course, CMHA is here to support you. We also have our Bounce Back program, which is free to access across Canada. It's a really helpful sort of collection of resilience building strategies. It is module based. There's also some coach assistance as well that will help you to manage some symptoms of mild to moderate anxiety, stress, or worry. And if that does extend into a crisis state or somebody around you is also experiencing a crisis, please also feel free to contact 988 at any time. So 365, 24/7. You can either call or text, depending on your preference, and you'll be connected to a crisis responder who will listen to you and provide that space that is required for you to create a plan for your safety. And I wanted to also, of course, remind you of some fantastic resources that you can utilize to continue or maybe even begin this conversation in your workplace. Learning the basics does have a really strong foundation for mental health literacy, really ensuring that everybody understands some of those really important differences. Then we can accent that with strategies to build and create that culture that we would like to see in our building culture. And I absolutely urge you, if you haven't already, to explore our Talking Openly portal that really goes through some very practical tips to find out how to have some of these open and vulnerable conversations. And finally, if you haven't yet already, any managers on the line or anybody who would like to provide access to leaders, you can absolutely explore our new interactive, manager e-learning series and resource library that is created and has been created specifically to foster safe, inclusive leadership strategies as well. So with that, thank you so much for being here, for taking the time out of your day for this little kind of early-ish in the year foundation setter. Take care, everybody.